What matters to me is the fact that data being the kind of engine behind these new types of technology matters. This industrial revolution, the so-called AI revolution, is powered by a resource that comes from us. And as such, it should mean that we can make this so-called revolution more socially sustainable. We can and should design interfaces between the users and the system in a way that doesn't just enable participation, but incentivizes long-term collective participation.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. Joining us today is Sylvie Delacroix from King's College London, where she holds the inaugural Jeff Price Chair in Digital Law. Her work is focused on data and machine ethics, ethical agency, and the role of habit within moral decisions. In addition to her chair at King's, she's also a visiting professor at Tohoku University in Japan. Sylvie is currently putting together the building blocks of the Centre for Data Futures at King's College London. And this project, I think it's fair to say, is typical of her career-long commitment to bridging the gap between theory and practice. The legal and ethical dimensions of data and AI can get pretty abstract pretty quickly. So I'm looking forward to Sylvie helping us to navigate our way through the smog of this during our conversation today. With our relationship with data, AI, and the legal implications of both set to be a dominant drumbeat in the years and decades ahead, I'm absolutely delighted that Sylvie accepted my invitation to appear on the podcast. And so, first of all, Sylvie, welcome to Data Malarkey.
Thank you, Sam.
Now, it's great to have you with us. I trust that was a decent summary of who you are and what you do. Is there anything that you'd like to add? Anything that I've got wrong?
I think it's a very good summary. I have nothing to add.
Very good. Now, listen, before we focus on data and ethics and the overlap between philosophy and morality and data and so on, I wanted to ask you a question that's designed to get to the heart of what makes you, you. And it doesn't necessarily ask you to tell us about your day-to-day work. So tell me, if you would, Sylvie, how do you spend your time?
I certainly spend too much time working for the moment. That is a very boring answer. I do also spend time with my family. Most recently, I was reminded just how bad I am at British humor. This is one of the things that is an interesting thing about me, actually. I just don't get British humor. I have to warn people if they make a joke and it's of an English kind of flavor, I probably won't get it. And sometimes it leads to misunderstanding. So that's something important, I suppose, I should flag right now.
Very interesting. Now, listen, we're going to be talking a lot about AI. We're going to be talking a lot about limitations, I guess, of AI, but also the opportunities. Just as a footnote, one of the things that I found, I'm interested in data, moving from data and from data to insight, and the way that we can build, take a bit of this and a bit of that and create something new, almost as a perhaps currently uniquely human facility. And I often think, when thinking about insight, that the movement from data to insight is quite similar to the construction of jokes. And I'm not about to expose your declared lack of understanding of English humor, but one of the things that I found, I know you've explored large language models so much more than me. One of the things I've found LLMs really bad at doing is telling jokes, be they jeu de mots or switcheroo or whatever type of joke. I don't know if you have any comment about, I know this is a left field question, but if you have any comment about the ability of generative AI at being funny.
Well, that's actually a great point, because one of the things I'm really interested about, and it's something that I feel is underexplored at the moment, is the extent to which, what makes these large language models really exciting from my perspective is the extent to which we can use them as conversational partners, right? So forget about these really clever, there have been all sorts of sensationalist claims about whether these, for instance, models should be deemed intelligent, whether they might even be showing something like intentionality, etc. And I find that these questions actually distract us from a fairly mundane but actually extraordinary opportunity that has been opened up, and that's the fact that these tools can be used as conversational partners. And if you think about this carefully, and you think about the role that conversation plays in our life, right? We don't just converse to convey information to each other. Sometimes we try to cheer each other up. Sometimes we actually try to, by trying to cheer each other up, we crack a joke or two, right? And one of the interesting things about this is that precisely in order for this to work well, we need to react to each other, right? So I need to read the very subtle cues that you might be expressing through your body language, through your voice intonation, etc. And also background information that I might have about you to try and figure out what might be understood as a joke by you. Yes. And so unfortunately, for instance, my English is good enough that most people will assume that I have a fairly good grasp of, I suppose the norms that underlie our understanding of jokes. And actually, this is something that I just persistently don't get, even though I've been 25 years in this country now. So that's something peculiar. And that's why I end up flagging this, because the cues I give, the signals that you might get from me, might lead to a misunderstanding, in the sense of a misunderstanding about my capacity to get particular kinds of jokes. And so that's actually you putting your finger on something really interesting about large language models. Is something that's missing at the moment, but that we could develop in a much more sophisticated way if, and that's a big if we make space for non-commercial kind of considerations in the development of these tools. And one of these things that I'm very keen to explore further is effectively the participatory affordances that are opened up by the fact that these tools have a kind of interface that allows feedback from us, right? Now, at the moment, this feedback is very primitive and based only on individual reactions, but there is room for making this feedback a lot more sophisticated, a lot more continuous, and potentially collective in kind, which I find fascinating. So anyway, I've opened up a lot of issues right now in answer to your question about jokes, but I think you've actually touched upon something really important in this respect.
Really, really interesting. And I mean, given what, for example, eye tracking can do in terms of demonstrate, I'm thinking both in commercial and non-commercial terms, what the developments in the last 20, 30 years that in eye tracking labs in psychology, in terms of where we pay attention, what that means, how much we actually take in. I guess that can only be getting faster and faster and faster. So rather than just taking in the words that we type, taking in the way that we look, if we're yawning, all of these different cues. Before we get into some of the specifics, I wanted, if you could tell us in the most kind of concrete possible terms about your day job, about what you're interested in. I know you've already begun to touch on this in the conversational partners, but what you're interested in, where you're focused, and how this relates to the wider world.
Yeah, basically, I've moved to KCL about 6 months ago, and as part of this move, I am setting up this new center, the Center for Data Futures, which is all about building participatory infrastructure over the life of data-reliant tools. So I have this is formulated quite openly for a reason. I don't want to commit myself to only AI tools. What matters to me is the fact that data being the kind of engine behind these new types of technology matters. And why does it matter? It matters because largely, at least a significant portion of this data that feeds AI tools, among others, a significant portion of this data comes from us as we live our lives on a daily basis, right? As we go shopping, as we go browsing, as we talk to our neighbors, etc. And so this can be seen as a threat, and it has justifiably led to interventions that try to take into account the fact that we're vulnerable. Yeah, that the fact that we leak data on a daily basis makes us vulnerable. And the kind of vulnerability at stake is actually an interesting kind of vulnerability. It's not a physical vulnerability. It's what I would call a sense of self vulnerability, right? It's that we're not used to basically having to be judged for a long time based on the profile that has been built on the basis of our data, right? So here I should reformulate this because it's quite a complicated way of putting this. But basically, we leak data on a daily basis. This data leads to profiles for each and every one of us, right? And these profiles, in turn, determine all sorts of things in the infrastructure that surrounds us. For instance, which kind of news we see, which kind of ads we might see, even what kind of friends we are encouraged to get in touch with, right? And so this kind of optimization of our infrastructure, of our environment based on this profile that has been itself based on the data we leak on a daily basis means that there's a very insidious phenomenon that you could call backwards tracking, in the sense that you're at risk of becoming the slave of who you are assumed to be based on the data you leak on a daily basis. So based on the machine trackable behavior in your past, right? So that can be an incredibly limiting and threatening phenomenon, right? We don't want to be tied to who we are anticipated to be based on our profile. We most of us at least feel like it's a very important thing that we're able to change, that the Sylvie I am today can become again a different Sylvie tomorrow. And that this process of transformation is not compromised by this highly sophisticated profile-based adaptation of my environment, right? So I hope I'm making this more or less clear, but this I think it's hard to take the full measure of the extent to which it's not just the news we see that are adapted or that are optimized based on a profile. It can be all sorts of things. Increasingly, the tools we use encourage us to only shop for the kind of things that we're more likely to find attractive, or even to get in touch with people who are more like us, etc., etc. And so that phenomenon, the optimization of our kind of digital existence, can be threatening. And that's what I call the sense of self vulnerabilities, the idea that never before has a sense of sense of self and the extent to which we can transform it been potentially compromised by the data that we leak on a daily basis. So that's a very particular vulnerability, right? And why was I talking about this vulnerability? I've lost track now. What was the question initially?
It was, I was asking about kind of your day job, what you're interested in, where you're focused on,
right.
and boy, have you answered in spades how that relates to the wider world, because you're talking about the shadow that we cast, or the persona that are created for us by Facebook and everybody else's algorithms. Yeah.
Yes, and so, but actually, I'm glad you've put me back on track, because the reason why I'm creating the Center for Data Futures is actually not limited to this concern about the vulnerabilities that are inherent in the extent to which we leak data on a daily basis. Actually, the center has a more positive spin to it. And the idea is to say, well, the fact that the data that powers AI comes from us is also a source of opportunity. And that opportunity has been so far, I think, underestimated. And what kind of opportunity am I talking about? I'm basically talking about the fact that unlike past industrial revolutions, so take the industrial revolution that was powered by coal, or the industrial revolution that was powered by water, this industrial revolution, the so-called AI revolution, is powered by a resource that comes from us. And as such, it should mean that we can make this so-called revolution more socially sustainable, in the sense that we should leverage that in a way that means we, and that means a variety of groups of people with different agendas, etc., have a voice, have an opportunity to influence how these new tools serve us, and hence what direction this AI revolution takes, right? So it's this bottom-up opportunity, if you want, that is still dormant, that is still underappreciated, in my view, because so far we've been very concerned, justifiably so, with the need to address the vulnerabilities that come with our leaking data on a daily basis. And that has led to top-down interventions like the GDPR, for instance, right? So we do need regulation. We do need things like data rights, which are extremely important. But my point, and that's what I'm trying to do in this center, is to say, look, there's more at stake here. If we only take the kind of fireman approach to data governance, like, how do we stem the threats? We risk overlooking what is actually a significant opportunity. And that's what I see as basically the bottom-up opportunity. That means we, in all our variety, there's no single we, but many different groups of people with different aspirations, should be able to shape the direction of the way in which AI takes us. So should be able to shape the direction of the AI revolution, in short. I hope I've made that more or less clear.
Very, very, very clear indeed. Yeah, I mean, there are a number, 2 or 3 strands I'd pick up on. One is it's great that you've got. I mean, obviously, there's the sort of the self-protection and the vulnerability that we need to be clearly very well aware of. But it's excellent to hear that there's that positive side, the opportunity. Something you said, not in answer to this question, but an earlier one, was about the opportunity for AI not to be dominated by commercial interests, or not to be commercial only, because there was an opportunity, wasn't there, way back when, for the World Wide Web not necessarily to become an advertising vehicle. That's the way that it ended. You made me think. A few Christmases ago, I left my phone. We had some older male relatives staying who, after a big Christmas lunch, just fell asleep watching motor racing for about 4 hours in a room in our house. I've never watched motor racing in my life. I couldn't be less interested in it, but I left my phone charging and I didn't go and pick it up. They watched 4 or 5 hours, or they slept through 4 or 5 hours worth of motor racing. And for the next 3 months, every single ad I was being served seemed to be something to do with motor racing, because the phone had heard, and he must be interested in this. But I'm really really encouraged by your, one, the positivity, but two, also the fact that let's not allow this time around, in this wave of the digital revolution with AI, let's not allow that to be wholly taken over. Of course, it's going to be in large part taken, but not wholly taken over just by commercial vested self-interests. And I also love the thought about reinvention. Maybe clearly it happens at kind of pivotal points in people's lives when they, I don't know, when they go to university, they may suddenly start, grow their hair, wear long raincoats and smoke cheroots, or what I'm just thinking about my own past. But this personal reinvention, but actually, because of the data leakage, it may be hard for us to have that personal reinvention, even if we do take on different ways of thinking and being. So just a couple of the strands. I mean, I know that it isn't really an explosion, but it sort of feels like an explosion. AI in the past couple of years, but I guess in terms of mass participation, mass use, how does that and what's coming make you feel about what we can do now that we couldn't do before, and kind of areas that you think we need to pay particular attention? You've talked about LLMs being conversational partners. What makes this next stage in our digital evolution or revolution different?
That is a big question, actually, and I think it's an important question, right? So there's been a huge wave of excitement after the release of GPT-3, and some people ask, was this wave of excitement ever justified? Like, is there anything particularly extraordinary about large language models after all? And my answer to that is, well, yes, there is something very special that has happened. And it's not to do with the properties of the tools themselves. Like, the large language models themselves, you shouldn't go and search for something very particularly extraordinary in the tools themselves. What is extraordinary is the way in which we can use them. So what is extraordinary is the kind of relationship that is now made possible by the fact that these tools can give us contextually appropriate answers to our queries. So the degree of fluency and the degree of context adequacy that the answers give us mean that we can find ourselves treating these tools as conversational partners. And that has never been possible before, right? And so if you ask yourself what makes the difference between, say, large language models and search engines, well, the answer has to do with precisely that. Yeah, search engines cannot be used as conversation partners. And that the significance of this difference, I don't think has quite sunk in yet. So a lot of the approaches when it comes to making sure that, say, large language models can communicate their outputs with some measure of reliability, right? That's a big problem. We know that they can sometimes so-called hallucinate. And unless we have ways of receiving these outputs with some measure of reliability, this is going to be a big obstacle to these tools being useful in contexts like healthcare, education, law in particular. And so there's huge amounts of energy, huge amounts of research being invested right now in improving or finding ways for these outputs to be communicated with some measure of reliability. Now, I think this research is super important. But what I find fascinating is that it's dominated. I mean, the literature is moving very fast, but pretty much everything I've read so far is dominated by the kind of harmlessness paradigm. So in short, and it's no surprise given that these large language models are mostly developed by big commercial entities, they want to make sure that the relationship between the users and the tool is harmless, right? That it doesn't cause harm, which should be a good thing in itself, right? And one of the ways in which it could cause harm is if we end up taking these outputs at face value without checking when we should be checking. And so this could lead to all sorts of harms. You can imagine, especially in contexts like healthcare or education, this could be a big problem. And so this harmlessness paradigm has been allowed to completely dominate or take over, if you want, the range of considerations that are deemed pertinent when we work on the communication of uncertainty for large language models. And one of the things that I feel passionate about right now is the fact that we really need to change that. So the range of pertinent considerations that we should take into account when we work on large language models and the way they communicate uncertainty is much wider. And so one of the things we need to take on board is the fact that because they can be used as conversational partners, they are going to change the nature of future conversations. This sounds obvious, right? When we talk to each other, we mold each other, right? I am influencing you, you are influencing me, and I'm constantly recalibrating this kind of interpretive baggage that I use to make sense of what you say. And same for you, right? So we constantly kind of subtly fine-tuning intuitions and habits that we rely on in order to make sense of each other. That's what humans do all the time when we talk to each other. The problem is that, of course, now we're faced with these tools who can produce outputs that look like so plausible. They look like they could be produced by another human being, that we can't help but bring to our conversation with these tools the same interpretive baggage, right? So we approach the conversations that we might be having with these tools, large language models, with the same habits, the same intuitions that have been slowly developed for humans and that are completely inadequate for these large language models, right? So how do we solve this? Like, how do we make sure that we don't end up not just anthropomorphizing these tools, but using them in nonsensical ways, right? Well, the answer to that can't be just limited to, oh yeah, we need to make sure that the outputs come with some measure of reliability. Yeah, that's important. But beyond that, we need to think about the way in which we talk about, I'm trying to think of an example. Let's say we talk about end of life care conversations, for instance, right? And I'm telling you, well, I'm not sure I would want to be treated for this disease. If it happens to me, I would want to consider other options, for instance, right? I'm talking about this. Now, why am I expressing this? I'm not sure. Like, why am I expressing uncertainty here? I'm probably doing that to flag the fact that I am committed to a kind of conversation that admits other perspectives, other viewpoints, other ways of seeing the world. And so I'm basically inviting you to come into the conversation and perhaps to air your own tentative views. This is one of those subjects where many of us are not too sure. We have conflicting intuitions. Often we have, what we call sometimes imperfectly rationalized intuitions. That's Bernard Williams, one of my heroes in philosophy. And so I'm worried about the extent to which if we don't bring in more work from, say, philosophy and sociology, etc., to really carefully consider how large language models could and should, perhaps in some contexts like healthcare, education, law, whether they should also be able to express or to put forward humility markers, right? So in the same way as when I say, I'm not sure I would want to be treated in this or that situation, it's basically a humility marker. And this is super important because it opens up a kind of conversation that is otherwise impossible, right? If I don't express uncertainty, then if you have tentative views on the subject, you may not feel comfortable enough, or you may not feel that it's the right forum for you to air your own kind of tentative views on the subject. So this role of humility markers and uncertainty communication for the purpose of opening up certain kinds of conversation, that's been completely under the radar so far. Like it's not really mentioned in work on large language models and uncertainty. And yet I think it's usually important, right? If today, we're already struggling quite a lot with making sure that we are still capable of conversations that are open enough to take into account a wide variety of views. And if we allow large language models to be deployed at scale, like they are likely to be in contexts like education, healthcare, justice, where these are morally loaded contexts, right? We never have a definitive view about what justice should look like or what good education consists in. This is going to be a live debate. And if it's going to remain a live debate, we need to be not just open to other perspectives, but also willing to keep asking questions. We need to keep what I call a spirit of inquiry, basically. And that cannot happen if the infrastructure we're surrounded with, and that's not just legal institutions, it's also, for instance, large language models. If this infrastructure doesn't communicate uncertainty at all, if it doesn't allow uncertainty to surface, then we're very likely to retreat and say, oh, well, then, I better just retreat in the comforts of my optimized existence and refrain from asking questions, right? So that I've talked a lot right now, but this is something that I feel quite strongly about, and where probably the window of opportunity to change the direction of travel when it comes to large language models in particular is small. I hope it's still there, but certainly commercial incentives alone are not going to get us there, right?
Hello there, it's your host Sam here. Well, if you've been inspired by this conversation and want to find out what type of data storyteller you are, why not visit our scorecard at data-storytelling.scoreapp.com, complete 12 simple questions, and you'll instantly be served with a report telling you what type of data storyteller you are. Now, back to the action. Yeah, I know. I quite agree. And I mean, listen, you know this, but 2 or 3 years ago, I wrote a book called "Asking Smarter Questions," all about that, and it was kind of pre the emergence of LLMs for sure. But I do think that the act of interrogation has been maybe not so much in philosophy, and I'll come back to that very shortly. To Socrates and the Socratic paradox, but the act of asking questions has really, it's not the way that we're validated at work. It's not the way that we're validated at school. We are validated and we are rewarded and we are examined by the answers that we give rather than the questions that we ask. I was originally a classicist, and whilst I got irritated beyond measure by Plato and the Socratic dialogues, one of the things that I think is incredibly attractive coming out of that whole kind of corpus of many dialogues is the often repeated Socratic paradox that Socrates wants to find out the essential nature of truth or beauty or justice. So let's say it's courage. Let's say it's courage. He gets a general along and he says, "Well, general, tell me what courage is. I want to find out what courage is." And the general will be, somebody at the top of his game, top of society, leading armies in successful wars, and he'll give an example. And Socrates will say, "Well, that's all very well, attacking in a brave way, but what about running away? What about this battle when everyone ran away and that was a great strategy?" That seems to be the very opposite of what you're saying. And the general gets tied up in knots by Socrates' clever argument. But the Socratic paradox of saying all that I know is that I know nothing, starting from a position of ignorance, even if you're very, very well informed in an area, but starting from a position of ignorance and being prepared to park prejudices and biases and prior knowledge and assumptions at the door. I hadn't heard the phrase before, but I'm stealing it. I'll credit you every time. But this phrase, I hadn't heard the phrase humility markers before we started talking. I guess that is it fair to say that the responses that come from large language models, where there's any degree of doubt currently, is when they don't, is really in areas where they don't want to stray. So if you ask them for something if you ask them to give a prejudiced or a biased response on gender or race or religion or whatever, they will humbly say, "I'm not going there," because I guess their creators, their paymasters, don't want them to say something that they're going to regret. But in my use of them, which clearly is not nearly as extensive as yours, but in my use of them, there's not much humility. Here's an answer, and some people say this and some people say that, and then you say, well, who's going to win the US election, or who's going to win? I don't make predictions. I'm an LLM, but are you beginning to see some of these humility markers appearing in the outputs of LLMs, or is it too early? Is that something that you're looking to engender through the work of the centre and other things?
Yeah, so it does require a change in the structure of the incentives that are currently running through these large language models, right? So if the incentive, for instance, if they are designed to produce an output that is most liked by the user, which is the current way in which they're structured, then they're very unlikely to come up with much in the way of humility markers. So this can be changed. This is not the structure of the incentives is not something that is untouchable. And so that's one of the things that I think is underestimated, is the extent to which these tools serve us and not the other way around. And what is quite remarkable is that because we have a participatory interface, because there are ways for us to feed back into the large language model, we can and should be thinking much harder about continuous feedback loops. So basically, can we build participatory interfaces that mean that groups of users, this is important, right? It won't work in all contexts, but in some contexts, can groups of users contribute to the continuous refinement of aspects of, for instance, the structure of the incentives or the way in which the model expresses uncertainty. Because this is not an easy thing. Like, imagine a group of GPs, right? They rely on the large language models, for instance, to assist them in perhaps considering a range of, for instance, likely diagnostic tools that they should be considering, right? And imagine that there's been progress and the large language model now communicates the output with some color-coded measure of confidence, right? So say you have like the top diagnostic tool that should really be considered with high degree of confidence is in red, and then it goes down to pink and white, perhaps, right? Now, you could say, okay, great. So you've communicated an output with some measure of confidence, which reflects the extent to which each, say, diagnostic tool comes up as a very prevalent, statistically likely thing to consider. But what if the output doesn't communicate the extent to which it might be incomplete? Yeah. So, for instance, this is something that's really important in healthcare. The large language model is not in front of the patient, right? So there are things that, by definition, the large language model doesn't know. It only knows what has been inputted, right? And so it could, another way of communicating uncertainty is to not just color code with different degrees of confidence various diagnostic tools, but also remind the GP practitioner saying, by the way, I am not in front of the patient, and please use your eyes and hands and ears to ascertain whether perhaps there's something missing in this list, because I don't have eyes, I don't have ears, and I don't have hands, right? So there's that. That's also a way of communicating uncertainty, but it's a different kind of uncertainty. It's a kind of reminder of incompleteness and so that is subtle. And you can imagine a scenario where GPs may want to refine that the way in which a large language model communicates incompleteness, for instance, right? And so how could it, for instance, be used to support a better, more receptive encounter with the patient, where imagine that a lot of the need to convey information when we go to a GP, it's actually really stressful, right? We only have 10 minutes typically to convey a lot of information. And more often than not, I forget half of it. And so you could have a scenario where all of this information exchange aspect has already happened in the background. Let's say I have some kind of assistant that has summarized some of my concerns, also some data about, I don't know, whatever data I'm willing to share. And that is exchanged with, say, the assistant of the GP, so that a lot of the background information is already exchanged. And the very precious 10 minutes that we have face to face can then be used to support what should really be a sense-making conversation where we're trying to make sense of each other. And most importantly, in 10 minutes, which is quite remarkable, the GP is trying to understand the root of the concerns and questions I might have, right? And so that effort, it's an interpretive effort, is not easy in the best of even in the best conditions. And so you could actually design large language models in a way that supports what I call situational awareness. So where you basically, you could design a large language model that's listening and perhaps supporting the GP saying, do you realize you haven't really taken into account what the patient said at time T, or something like that, right? So there are ways of designing these tools that go so far beyond just the brute, let's optimize, information analysis for some kind of accurate output, whether it's diagnostic or whatever it is. And consider the fact that because they're conversational tools, they can help in these much more subtle sense-making endeavors, right? And that is a tricky art. It's a very delicate art. And that's something that at the moment, large language models are not designed to do, right? But there's nothing that stops them from being developed in that way, in my view. At least we should try much harder than we currently do. So that's one of the things that currently, for instance, I'm discussing with a group of GPs who are interested in this. And I think it's opening the doors to questions that are really important. Similarly, in education, for instance, some researchers have found that they could tweak the way in which that was GPT-3, so it's already really old, but the way in which GPT-3 produced the outputs could be tweaked in a way that encouraged children to ask more curious questions, to be more curious, basically, in their interactions with the large language model. And I find that fascinating, right? So how you can change the structure of incentives for objectives that are completely different from just user satisfaction, like brute user satisfaction. So in my view, I hope we're still in the very early days of large language models where we're faced with pretty primitive structures and incentives. And I very much hope that also somehow we can make room for input and continuous feedback from communities of users so that those choices are not just made by commercial designers, that they could, at least in part, be made by the users themselves. It raises tricky questions, right? Because sometimes it could compromise performance, etc. There are all sorts of difficult questions. But I don't think we've worked enough on that to rule this out just yet.
I'm fascinated by uncertainty. Previous guests on this podcast have included Olivia Jensen, who runs the Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk, and David Spiegelhalter at Cambridge. I'm actually just reading his book, The Art of Uncertainty, and I love that it came out a couple of months ago at the time of recording, and I love there was one section in particular I've read recently, all talking about what different degrees of uncertainty or probability or likelihood mean in terms of percentage figures. And it was so interesting to hear you talk about that color coded from red to pink to white. Clearly, there are going to need to be quite sophisticated algorithms that underpin this expression of uncertainty. The other strand that I was thinking about, one of the I spoke to when I was researching this book on asking questions and smarter questions. I spoke to people whose jobs were predicated on their ability to ask questions that get answers that are helpful. And I spoke to doctors and lawyers and market researchers and data analysts and academics and a whole variety. Zen Buddhists who asked a completely different type of question, the open-ended koan type questions, but a whole variety of different people. And one of the learnings I found, particularly from GPs, and I think it's really instructive and interesting that you're working with a group of GPs in this way. One of the frustrations I think that many have felt, partly in just the 10-minute window that you talk about, but also in the kind of the forced diagnosis through COVID and then post-COVID over the phone or on video conferencing software, is that they can't. Some of the most useful questions a general practitioner will ever ask are the hand on the door question or the I'm just putting my coat on question. Because I come in and I say, doctor, I've got an ingrowing toenail and it's hurting a lot and look at my toe. And then, GPs will always, even in that 10 minutes, as you're putting the coat on or you've got the hand or anything else, oh, well, yes, doctor, I've been coughing up blood recently. And suddenly it opens up. And that ability to not just so much have the time, but that ability to pick up on the nonverbal cues or the silences or the pauses. And I love your prescription of let's get those pre-vetted questions dealt with by the medical team, and then exploring this whole area of uncertainty. I hadn't, before talking to you, before meeting you, before not just before this conversation, but also looking at what you're doing, I hadn't thought about the massive potential there is for LLMs to really get to uncertainty. Because as I say, the responses clearly to search engines are, here are the answers, and the responses so far from LLMs are, this is what seem to be the answers, and so on and so forth. Now, listen, we've had a fascinating chat, and you've answered many of the questions that I was thinking of asking you along the course of the way. I guess just before asking you about where our listeners and viewers can find out about you and your work, I guess I've got what I might call a Columbo question, kind of just sort of one more thing type question. In the way that you're looking to work with data at the centre for Data Futures, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think I should have asked you?
Okay. I think I'm more the guilty part in that I've tried to talk about so many things that I've overlooked one key point probably. And that key point is to say, at the moment, there's a lot of people talking about participatory infrastructure at the point of data generation and data collection, right? So you may or may not have heard about data empowerment structures. It can be data trust, data co-ops. I won't get into that. There's no time now. But essentially, there is a growing social movement that tries to acknowledge the fact that when it comes to data, if you want to give a voice to people, you need to enable groups of people to come together and pool together the rights they have over the data to achieve a number of things. It can be get better terms and conditions from service providers or monitor data sharing agreements, etc., etc. But the key aspect is to say our current legal system, data rights, important as they are individual rights. And it's completely overlooking the significance of groups and the fact that data is always relational. My data is also my family's data, my neighbor's data, etc. And so because of this relational aspect, it makes no sense to only focus on the individual. So this is one big kind of blind spot in our legal system today, is we don't really have intelligent answers when it comes to collective aspects of governance or group empowerment. Yeah. So there's something that's gaining momentum across the world. You can check from the Data Empowerment Fund or the Data Trust Initiative, etc. But so that's the kind of data empowerment movement, let's call it like that. And that's all happening at the point of data collection or data generation. And what I'm trying to do, which is new, I suppose, is to say, look, why should we limit this conversation about the importance of participatory infrastructure and the importance of bottom-up empowerment to the point of data generation? Why don't we also consider the extent to which at the point of deployment, we can and should design interfaces between the users and those systems in a way that doesn't just enable participation, but incentivizes long-term collective participation. That's not an easy one, right? So again, lawyers, for instance, have been talking about the right to contest decisions or the right to have an explanation, which is all great. But again, it's still too focused on an individual asking a question at time t and assuming that that individual will have the motivation to ask question, the motivation to contest the output. And I think that's too optimistic. And so we need to think harder about how we design these tools in a way that really makes it attractive and engaging to critically assess, to critically engage with the outputs of whatever system we're dealing with. And that really means modifying the architecture of those tools sometimes. Right? It could be making them more tinkerable. I love that word, tinkerability. Or it can be to make them to make it more transparent that, for instance, you get remote homework. Oh, I could have had completely different homework if the provider had chosen a different model trained on different kinds of data, for instance, right? That suddenly becomes a lot more interesting from the perspective of the user. And you're like, oh, but actually I prefer that homework. And you start asking more questions. So I think we're still in really the dark days of basically thinking critically about what makes us more likely to critically engage with these tools, right? and beat the kind of automation bias that we unfortunately all have, right? We face with the outputs of a machine, whether you're piloting a plane or whether you are some administrator approving, I don't know what that means, request. We tend to say the computer says so, and that's it. And so that automation bias can be overcome, but it requires intelligent kind of design choices. So that's what I wanted to flag, and what I probably haven't spent enough time explaining is the link between bottom-up participatory infrastructure at the point of data generation on one hand, and on the other hand, bottom-up infrastructure or participatory infrastructure at the point of interface design. And that, I think, is not happening enough right now. And the two are tied, because actually to have participatory interfaces, you often need data empowerment structures as well, right? But so that's what I wanted to flag. And that's what I hope the Center for Data Futures can help move along effectively in terms of conversation.
Very good. And you've taught me my favorite word of the year. Tinkerability is a fantastic word. I've never heard it before. I shall be using it at every opportunity. And I think you're quite right. I had a spell as a behavioral psychologist. One of the challenges of the digital age is that it feeds information. Is that even for a simple search engine, now LLMs, who knows what in years to come, we're now getting. You talked a lot about the conversational partner nature of LLMs that sets them apart from search engines, but information is produced. It can be visual, it can be verbal, it can be animation, but information is produced. And I think that one of the fundamental misunderstandings of behavioral psychology is that you just need to give people enough information and they will yield. But you need to give people information, motivation, and the behavioral skills to make those changes. And I love your example of the alternative homework that could have been there. Giving people the motivation. You've used the word several times of incentives. I think that's hugely exciting, and also, we haven't been passive recipients, but it's been kind of one way. And you're talking about making this very much more multi-dimensional, not passive recipients. Brilliant. Listen, Sylvie, finally, where can our listeners and our viewers find out about you and your work and the Centre for Data Futures? Where should they head online?
Well, there's the Centre for Data Futures website, which is on KCL /research/Centre for Data Futures. Otherwise, there's delacroix.uk, where I try to keep track of various publications, etc. I think these two links should be enough to get a good idea of what's going on.
Perfect. Listen, thank you so much for your time, Sylvie. I think if there were only more people with your approach to using data smarter, there would be rather less malarkey in the world of data ethics and rather more data-driven common sense. Sylvie Delacroix, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalised report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.